Families spend a great deal of time preparing for the medical realities of a loved one's final year. Doctor's appointments, medications, mobility concerns. What almost nobody prepares them for is everything else, the parts of this season that have nothing to do with symptoms and everything to do with how a family itself begins to shift and strain, and sometimes surprise itself entirely. Today, I want to talk about 7 of those changes, the ones that catch families off guard, not because they involve the body, but because they involve each other. The first change is one that arrives quietly, and then all at once. At some point during this final year, the roles inside a family begin to reverse. The parent who spent decades making decisions, signing checks, driving to appointments, giving advice whether it was asked for or not, gradually becomes the one waiting to be told what happens next. And the adult child, who spent their entire life being the one cared for, suddenly finds themselves reviewing medication schedules, speaking to doctors on their parents' behalf, making calls that once would have been entirely unthinkable to make without permission. I think of a woman named Diane, an accountant by profession, who described the exact moment this shift became undeniable to her. Her father, a retired judge known throughout his career for his commanding presence in any room, sat quietly in a doctor's office while Diane answered a question the doctor had actually directed at him because he had simply paused a beat too long, and she had filled the silence out of habit before either of them realized what had happened. She told me she caught her father's eye right after, and neither of them said anything, but something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement that the family's entire structure had just quietly rearranged itself without either of them ever agreeing to it out loud. What made this particular moment so difficult for Diane, she later admitted, was not the practical shift itself, which she genuinely did not mind handling. It was the grief buried inside it, the quiet mourning of a father who had always been the one steering every important conversation in her life, now sitting back and allowing her to steer instead. She described feeling, in that single moment in the doctor's office, both proud of her own capability and profoundly sad about exactly what that capability now meant for the man who had raised her. The second change is one families rarely discuss honestly, though nearly every hospice worker has watched it unfold more times than they can count. Old sibling dynamics, rivalries, and resentments that may have gone dormant for decades often resurface with surprising intensity during a parent's final year, usually centered around disagreements about care. One sibling insists on a certain treatment path, another disagrees entirely. One sibling feels they are carrying the full weight of daily caregiving, while others, often living farther away, seem to offer only opinions from a distance. These disagreements rarely stay contained to logistics. They tend to reopen far older wounds: who was always the favorite, who left home first and never fully returned, who has always managed to avoid the harder responsibilities. A man named Peter told me about the several months before his mother passed, when he and his 2 sisters found themselves arguing bitterly over a hospital bed positioned in what had once been his mother's sewing room, an argument that, looking back, had almost nothing to do with the actual bed at all. It was really about who had shown up over the years and who had not, feelings that none of them had ever spoken aloud until grief and exhaustion finally forced them to the surface. He told me the disagreement eventually led to one of the most honest conversations the 3 siblings had ever had, decades of unspoken resentment finally addressed directly, though he wishes it had not taken their mother's decline to finally force that conversation into the open. He also told me something worth mentioning here, because I think it applies far beyond his own family. The sibling who lived closest and handled the most daily caregiving was not necessarily the one most at peace by the end. In some ways, the siblings living farther away, who visited less frequently, but with less accumulated exhaustion behind each visit, found it easier to remain patient and generous throughout the process. Peter came to understand that proximity and exhaustion often shape a person's temper during this season, just as much as genuine love or commitment does, a distinction that is easy to lose sight of in the heat of an argument over something as ordinary as where a hospital bed should go. The third change is one that genuinely confuses families because it seems to contradict everything they have been told to expect. At some point during this final year, many people experience what hospice workers sometimes call a rally, a period of surprising clarity, energy, and even appetite, appearing seemingly out of nowhere after a period of decline. A person who has barely spoken in days suddenly holds an entire conversation. Someone who has eaten almost nothing for a week suddenly asks for a full meal and finishes it. Families often interpret this rally as genuine recovery, a turning point, only to be devastated when decline resumes shortly afterward, sometimes within days. I remember hearing about a woman whose grandmother, after weeks of steady decline, suddenly sat up one afternoon and asked for her hair to be properly styled, something she had not requested in months, and spent the entire visit laughing and reminiscing with a clarity the family had not seen in what felt like a very long time. The family celebrated, genuinely believing she had turned a corner. She passed away 4 days later. Hospice staff explained afterward that this kind of temporary rally is a recognized, if not fully understood, part of this particular season. And while it never comes with any guarantee about what it means for the days ahead, it often does represent a genuine, precious window, worth treasuring exactly as it is, rather than a promise of continued improvement. The fourth change involves paperwork, of all things, and it catches nearly every family off guard because nobody wants to discuss it while there is still time to address it calmly. Wills that were promised but never finalized. Advance directives that were discussed in theory but never actually signed. Bank accounts, passwords, insurance policies, and property deeds that only one person ever fully understood, and that person is precisely the one now losing the capacity to explain any of it clearly. Families frequently discover, in the middle of an already overwhelming season, that critical decisions and documents were simply never put in proper order, forcing rushed, stressful conversations and paperwork exactly when calm and clarity are hardest to come by. A woman named Sandra described the frantic weeks after her father's decline accelerated suddenly, when she and her brother discovered he had never updated a will drafted decades earlier, one that still listed a business partner who had passed away years before and made no mention of grandchildren born long after it was written. Untangling this, involving lawyers and courts during a season already consumed by grief and exhaustion, added a layer of stress neither of them had anticipated needing to manage on top of everything else. She told me the lesson she took from that experience, one she now shares with any friend willing to listen, is that these conversations need to happen years before they feel urgent, not in the frantic scramble of a final season when clarity and calm are already in such short supply. Sandra also mentioned something that surprised her, which was how much simpler the entire process became once she and her brother finally sat down with their father directly, rather than continuing to whisper about it privately between themselves. He was, in the end, entirely willing to discuss his wishes plainly once someone finally asked, and seemed almost relieved to finally address details he had quietly been avoiding for years. She told me she wishes she had understood sooner that her own reluctance to raise the subject, born entirely out of a wish not to upset him, had actually been the greater obstacle the whole time, far more than any reluctance on his part. The fifth change is one of the most emotionally complicated, and it involves grief itself arriving earlier than most people expect, well before an actual death occurs. This is sometimes called anticipatory grief, a genuine mourning process that begins while someone is still alive, as families slowly absorb the reality of an ending that has not yet arrived but has become increasingly undeniable. What complicates this further is that different family members often experience this anticipatory grief at entirely different paces, creating friction that can feel confusing and even hurtful. One sibling may already be grieving openly, while another insists on maintaining hope and normalcy, and each can feel, quite genuinely, that the other is handling this all wrong. A man named Elliot told me about tension that arose between himself and his wife during his mother's final year, tension neither of them expected. He had begun grieving months before his mother passed, withdrawing somewhat from extended family gatherings, finding them painful in ways he struggled to articulate. His wife, meanwhile, wanted to maintain every tradition exactly as always, insisting normalcy was the kindest gift they could offer his mother during her remaining time. Neither of them was wrong, he told me later, but neither of them understood, in the moment, that they were simply grieving on entirely different timelines, a realization that only became clear to both of them well after his mother had passed. The sixth change involves the nature of visits themselves, which shift in character more than families typically anticipate. Conversations that once filled hours begin shrinking into simple, quiet presence, sitting together without much talking at all, holding a hand, reading aloud from a favorite book, simply existing in the same room without any particular agenda. Families sometimes worry that these quieter visits mean they are somehow failing to provide enough stimulation or entertainment, when in truth, this shift toward simple companionship, rather than active conversation, is one of the most natural and most valued parts of this particular season, both for the person nearing the end of their life and for the family member sitting quietly beside them. I think of a granddaughter who described feeling initially awkward and even a bit useless during visits with her grandfather in his final months, since their once lively conversations about politics and old family stories had grown shorter and quieter with each visit. It was a hospice chaplain who gently reassured her that simply being present, without needing to fill every silence with conversation, was itself a profound gift, one that mattered far more than any particular topic of discussion ever could. She told me that once she released the pressure to entertain or engage him constantly, their visits together became some of the most peaceful, meaningful hours she had ever spent with him. The seventh and final change is one that often goes almost entirely unnoticed until the entire season has passed, and it involves the caregiver themselves. Whoever takes on the bulk of caregiving during this final year, whether an adult child, a spouse, or another close family member, often finds their own entire life quietly reorganizing itself around this role. Their career, their friendships, their own health and rest, all gradually rearranged to accommodate the increasing demands of this season. This shift happens so gradually that many caregivers do not fully recognize how much of themselves they have set aside until the caregiving itself has ended, and they are left, quite suddenly, with an identity and daily structure they no longer entirely recognize. A woman named Rosalind told me that in the 2 years she spent as her husband's primary caregiver during his decline, she had gradually stopped attending her weekly book club, stopped seeing several close friends with any regularity, and had not taken a single day entirely for herself in longer than she could clearly remember. It was only after he passed that she recognized fully how completely her own life had been reshaped around his care, and how much of her own identity she would now need to rebuild almost from scratch in a season of grief that arrived layered on top of an already profound exhaustion she had not fully acknowledged while she was living through it. I want to close by saying something that I believe matters more than any single one of these 7 changes individually. None of this is a sign that your family is doing something wrong. Every one of these shifts, the reversal of roles, the resurfacing of old wounds, the confusing rally, the scramble over paperwork, the mismatched pace of grief, the quieter visits, the caregiver's own disappearing sense of self, are simply part of what this particular season asks of every family who walks through it. Naming these changes honestly before they arrive and catch you by surprise will not make this year painless. Nothing truly can, but it may help you meet each of these moments with a little more understanding, a little more patience toward the people you love and toward yourself. As you move through what is, without question, one of the most difficult and most meaningful chapters a family ever shares together. I have come to believe, after everything families have shared with me over the years, that the families who move through this season with the least regret are rarely the ones who avoided conflict or grief entirely. They are the ones who allowed these 7 changes to happen honestly, in the open, rather than pretending each one away out of discomfort. There is real wisdom in simply expecting the unexpected, in understanding ahead of time that old wounds may surface, that grief may arrive unevenly, that a hospital bed argument is very rarely just about the bed. That understanding alone will not make any of it painless, but it may make it a little less lonely and a little less confusing when it finally arrives at your own door. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this gave your family some language for what you are already living through, I hope you will share it with someone else walking this same road. Stay with us here at Golden Wisdom, and I will see you in the next one.